Thanks so much for making time to join us today. The University Interdisciplinary Colloquium is an event that's conducted every couple of weeks, organized by the Center for Interdisciplinary in the College of Arts and Letters. The point of the colloquium really is to provide a forum for thinking about and kind of celebrating the contributions that the arts and humanities make to interdisciplinary work across our campus. So it's a real chance for us, hopefully, to learn more about the impact that the arts and humanities can have on these complex research projects. The next UIC will be on the 26th of October, in 2 weeks, in this room. Rachel A. White from the Department of Geography, Environment, and Spatial Science will deliver a presentation entitled Imagining the Past Through Technical Documents and Personal Accounts, Remote Sensing and Our History. That's in 2 weeks at noon. In about 90 minutes, at 1:30, the Center for Interdisciplinarity is launching a new coffee hour, basically, at South Kedzie 523. So that's the conference room associated with the center. We'll probably just grab what's left of our stuff, take it with us, and you're all invited to join us if you have that hour free, or even just part of it. Stop by and hang out and talk about interdisciplinary stuff with other folks who are just as interested in that as you are. And I think the plan with that, by the way, is that we'll do that after every interdisciplinary colloquium. So every couple of weeks, there'll be a coffee hour over at South Kedzie. And again, you're all invited. Today we're very happy to have with us Professor Benjamin Lauren. Professor Lauren is an assistant professor in the Department of Writing, Rhetoric, and American Cultures here at MSU. He's assistant director of the MA in Digital Rhetoric and Professional Writing, and a Hub for Innovation and Learning and Technology Fellow. Before starting at MSU, he spent 7 years as instructor and senior instructor of writing at Florida International University, where he co-founded and coordinated the English department's digital writing studio. At MSU, he teaches courses in professional writing, experience architecture, and rhetoric in writing. Now, his teaching and research and service aim to help people learn, create, communicate, participate in today's increasingly complex and expansive institutional, organizational, and community networks. In addition to a number of journal articles that he's published, Rutledge's ATTW series published his first book recently, titled Communicating Project Management, a Participatory Rhetoric for Development Teams. You should check it out here after this. And today he's with us to deliver a presentation entitled How Project Managers Foster Interdisciplinary Communication. Professor Lauren.
Thank you, Michael. So I'm really excited to be here to talk to you about the book today. And I'm going to talk to you about pieces of the book and parts of it, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a new project that I'm working on. As Michael told you, I'm an assistant professor in Writing, Rhetoric, and American Cultures, and that's in the College of Arts and Letters here at MSU. That means that I'm a humanist, and so my approach to studying project management is decidedly humanist. I'm particularly interested in human experiences at work. And so some of the stuff I'll talk to you about today was my way of approaching that and trying to learn about that and what we can learn from the way that project managers are communicating today. So a bit of an overview. Let me start the slideshow. A bit of an overview for what we'll be doing today. I'm going to start off with the scenario. I'm going to ask you to do something, and then I will get into a little bit about the book, some of the cases, not all of them, but some of the cases from the book, what I learned from that, and then we'll go back to that scenario and see if some of the things that I learned might change the way that you would approach it. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the case study that I've been working on, or a project more recently, about housing insecurity here at MSU. So let's first start with the case study. Here's a context. The teacher in me couldn't resist this. You manage a meeting each week that involves people from different colleges across the university. 10 people participate in this meeting. Sometimes 2 or 3 people call into the meeting rather than attend face-to-face. The goal of the meeting is to coordinate work across the group. You note that the situation is this. You note that at the last 2 weekly updates, one person in the group seems disengaged and their report is not very detailed. This marks a change in their previous approach, which was lively, detailed, and at times even funny. You don't know this person very well, but they've been with the university for several years, and you know folks who work with them. Your interactions have generally been positive. What would you do about the situation? Would you do anything? So write down your answer in a few brief sentences, and I'm going to ask you to keep that to yourself just for now. Or you could think about it, try to remember it. All right, so I'm going to move on because in my practice sessions, I was going a little long. So if you're finishing up, that's okay. So I want to set the stage for the talk to tell you a little bit about what I was doing in the book and the way that I was approaching my book, because that's the research that I'm telling you about today. And so it's hard to, in a slide, tell you what you write about or tell, all of you what I've written about in, almost 200 pages, but I'm going to do my best to tell you some of the main points. There are three main things I want to tell you. The first is that when I approached the research in the book, and the book is called Communicating Project Management, obviously, one of the things that I was assuming is that the shape of our organizations have changed, right? For a long time when we thought about organizations, we thought of them as sort of like places that were more contained, right? They were things that we might think of as containers. If you pour water into a glass, that contains the water, and we thought of organizations in that way. But in a lot of the high-tech industry organizations and institutions that I was studying and working in, I'd noticed that had changed a lot. Most of the people I were talking with were working on distributed teams. They were working with people that they may never see face-to-face. They may never meet face-to-face. Teams were decentralized across the world, and so project work was decentralized across the world. And so rather than thinking of organizations as a container, I was thinking of them more as a network. Excuse me. When you start thinking of communication as networked rather than as in co-located, some significant things changed, right? And I wanted to say, well, what are those things? How did those things change with project management? And so that was a central question that I was asking as I approached the book. A second thing I want to tell you, okay, and I'm glossing over a lot of details that I'm happy to answer questions about later, but the second thing that I want to tell you is if all of this if we start seeing organizational communication has changed as becoming more networked, then the second thing is that there's a sort of a, project management has talked about this a lot, that there's sort of a lack of theoretical input into it as a practice, right? So on the one hand, we have organizational networks, and then on the other hand, project management has been spending a lot of time going, well, how do we react to this? How do we react to this without ever pausing and saying, well, what theory can we develop to help us react to this, right? And so I thought, well, my book might be able to do some of that work. And so I wanted to develop a theory to help us think about where did project management come from, and then how does it need to change given this network communication? The third thing I really started to think about, and this was kind of an aha moment for me, because I started to do some historical looking into where project management came from. And project management can kind of be traced back. I learned from a scholar in our field by the name of Joanna Schreiber in professional writing that, we can trace it back to Fordism and Taylorism in the early 1900s when we were building things, right? We were building cars. And so if you look at political cartoons from that time, you might notice that, they would have, like Henry Ford standing there with a stopwatch saying, you only have 60 seconds to do this thing, because the idea was to eliminate waste and get more cars out to make more money. It was all about efficiency, in other words. And so what I thought was interesting is that when you have people co-located, thinking about efficiency works, but once you have them networked, thinking about efficiency becomes a lot harder, right? You have people distributed all across the world, and if efficiency is your primary goal for communication, you're going to often be stuck against time zones and other things like that. And so I started asking questions about, well, if efficiency is where we started, where are we now, right? And I kind of had this aha moment one day. I was reading an article by Erin Frost, again in professional writing, and and the article was about something she called apparent feminism. And what I found fascinating about her article is that she made this argument that efficiency emphasizes in the workplace certain ways of seeing the world and working together. And it leaves a lot of people out. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And so to me, that meant, oh, there's a paradigm shift. We started off with efficiency, but now we're at participation. And so in a networked environment, my argument in the book is the paradigm has shifted. When you're managing a project, you're no longer communicating just for efficiency. You're also communicating for participation. And what does that mean? What does that look like? Is there evidence of that? And so I took that to the book and I started saying, okay, before I start collecting data, let me ask some questions about this. My field talks about project management in a few ways that I think is kind of interesting. One of the first ways is they'll talk about collaboration a lot. And collaboration to me was interesting when I started reading about it because, and I've given you a very quick definition of it here. Collaboration is the people who are actually doing the work on a project, right? So I imagine, people sitting, say, writing a grant application, and maybe they're from different disciplines and they want to do some research together. They're sitting around a table and they're actually writing this together. Maybe they're not all in the same room. Maybe they're distributed because they're at the different universities and they're writing this thing together. They're giving each other feedback. They're collaborating. They're actually doing the work. Coordination is another term that we use a lot. Coordination is actually like designing the workflows, right? And so we'll study how people design those workflows and then ultimately how they're organizing work. And that's how the field has thought about project management. But participation was absent from the discussion. And I thought, well, that's interesting because both collaboration and coordination assume participation. And that's not always true, right? That's not always true. And so I thought, well, there's something to this, right? There's something to this. And so here's an overview of the case studies in the book. I'm only going to talk to you about case 1 and 2. With case 1, I did some semi-structured interviews with 14 people at different places of their careers, and they were working at different places too. I have noted here that 7 men and 7 women, but also there were also different cultural backgrounds, right? And so that was something that I tried to recruit widely and broadly to get a range of experiences practicing and communicating project management at work. For the second case, I did experience sampling, which is a form of diary study. And I recruited 2 people from the first case whose answers seemed to speak to me quite a bit about different experiences that they'd had in the workplace. And I asked them if we could take a deeper dive, and we spent about just over a month sampling their experiences each week. And each week I kind of themed what their experiences would be on. So the third case I'm not going to have time to talk about, but I wanted to give you a little bit of background on the cases. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the first case here, and I'm going to hand you out something for you to take a look at real quickly. There we go. This is a more extensive version of what it comes from the book. It's a table that's in the book, and this is sort of like a shorter version of that. So, as I told you, work has become decentralized in these high-tech environments. One of the reasons for this is that the problems that they were trying to solve had become far more complex, right? We call these wicked problems. They're problems that are hard to define. There's multiple factors as to why it's difficult to solve, and it usually requires interdisciplinary teams. And so if you can imagine, many of these decentralized teams may or may not have a project manager assigned to them. It may be somebody whose job it is on that team to be the project manager. It may be that they're all sharing in that. And the fact that they might be sharing in that is going to influence the ways in which they communicate with each other, right? So one of the ways that I started thinking about this was just to sort of ask them, what are some of the things that influence the way that you communicate with people in these decentralized networks? And so I came across a range of what I ended up calling factors through my coding. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this. So one of the ways that they learned to communicate sort of on the job was to think about personality type. And I suspect that that's because there's a fair amount of literature on that. How do you communicate with somebody who's an introvert, for instance, when you're an extrovert? And so you can see some of the strategies on the sheet that I gave you for the ways in which they thought about that. Some of the responses I felt were really interesting, like for instance, with personality type, understanding your own personality type and how that might clash with somebody else's, or understanding your own affect and how important that was when you were sitting and working with a team, right? So I thought that was a really interesting finding. The findings on gender, however, I found kind of disheartening. As you're looking over them, you might notice some of that. I'll tell you a few stories. For instance, one of the participants, she told me about how she actively, knowing that she worked on teams of men, she actively worked to make herself gender neutral to fit in. I had another participant who was a man tell me, when I'm talking to the guys on my team, I'll frequently talk to them about comic books and tech things and gaming, because that's what they like. But if I'm talking to a woman, I'm not necessarily going to talk about those things, because women don't like games, apparently. I also heard things like, I don't see any gender problems at my workplace. I don't think that's a thing, right? And I have to acknowledge in saying all of this that as a white male, people may not have wanted to really talk to me about some of these things, and so the snippets that I got may not have been accurate. But I want to be careful in this because of the way that the chart reads. It might be showing that I'm saying, oh, no, these are good strategies to have. In actuality, it's important to understand that what the strategies actually show is a realistic glimpse of what people are doing and thinking, right? And so this section in particular, the findings, is something I think project managers have to be more aware of, the systems and the ways that people are operating inside of the systems, right? And so what's surfaced here aren't strategies necessarily that I think are always productive, right? Cultural and linguistic diversity was another sort of interesting moment for me. I thought that some of the strategies here really showed sort of like a broader understanding of things like, if I'm working with somebody who's who's connecting from India, and maybe the conversation that we're going to have as a group is in English and they're not comfortable of answering questions in an open forum in this way, that one of the things I'll do is I'll send them the questions ahead of time and tell them, hey, you could prepare this in writing if you want. I'd be happy to look over it ahead of time too if you want somebody to bounce ideas off of. And slowly, as I started to do this, I'm telling this as a bit of a story, I started to recognize there was something going on here with space, right? And by space, I mean there was something going on here with people finding space or not finding space for themselves in project work. It started to make me think like, oh, when we're thinking about participating on teams, when we're thinking about communicating in participatory ways, what we're doing is we're talking about space and who has space to participate and who doesn't, right? And this was sort of an aha moment for me. The cultural and linguistic diversity was the first moment where I started to see this in the findings. I saw this more in the building, maintaining relationships, and you can see there's a range of strategies under there. But attending to psychological safety was maybe the turning point for me in the book, because this was the first case, so it was the first data I was spending a lot of time with. And this is where I thought, oh, what project managers are spending a lot of time doing on these decentralized teams and these decentralized networks, what they're doing a lot of the time is they're spending time trying to invite people to participate in project work, and that's what their communication is all about. To make space for people, to invite them to exercise their agency and act, or not act if that's what their choice is, right? And to learn from that. And attending to psychological safety, this idea of psychological safety, by the way, comes from Amy Edmondson's work. You might have heard about it in Google, a report that Google recently released. But they're really taking that idea from Amy Edmondson's 1999 article on it, where she talks about psychological safety and team environments really means that you're not afraid to go and fail publicly. And that if the team environment is psychologically safe, or it has a high degree of psychological safety, then that means that you're willing to go out, take some risks, and if you fail, it's okay. And that leadership is essential to setting that tone, right? That leadership is essential to setting that tone. And so you'll see that project managers on this list had several ways that they started thinking about psychological safety. Sometimes it was checking in with somebody after a meeting. Sometimes it was being available, having open door policies, right? The idea was that none of these strategies were static. They were constantly in motion. But that it was always sort of showing this tension between efficiency and participation. That while a lot of our workplace environments were thinking about efficiency, they were trying to move toward participation, and project managers were sort of at ground zero. Some of the other things that had happened is that I noticed development methodologies and the ways that they treated them had changed. And in industry, especially in high tech, there's a lot of discussion about whether or not you're agile enough, right? And agile is a term that we hear a lot these days. We'll hear somebody say, yes, we're an agile team, which basically they're trying to signal we're creative and flexible. But people who are truly agile have very particular orientations toward it. And sometimes the conversation will become almost about purity. You're either not agile enough or you need to be more agile because you're not following the rules. And a friend of mine I had a conversation with, his name is John Hedke, said to me, most people practice Scrum But, which is Scrum But we changed it, right? And that's how a lot of the teams sort of focused on this as a development methodology. So getting back to the idea of like how they approach this as a communication standpoint, they tried not to overlay, project managers tried not to take something like Agile and overlay it a team and let it rule their communication. Because Agile is focused on efficiency. It doesn't necessarily conjure participation, which is interesting, right? I'll give you an example. If you imagine people in a scrum, do we know what a scrum is? Yes, more or less. Let me tell you what a scrum is. It's when you get a group of people, usually about 10 people together, they stand up in a circle. Sometimes they call this sort of like daily reporting. And they answer 3 prompts, and they go through one by one. And the first person will say something to the effect of, I've been working, or yesterday I worked on, right? And today, which is a coordination issue. Today, I'm planning to work on, which is another coordination. And then I'm struggling with, or I have a problem with, or I need somebody to help me solve this problem, which is more of a problem-solving thing. And Scrum is an interesting environment because it's meant to efficiently get people on the same page. Yet again, my research showed me that not everybody participates in the Scrum in the same way. If there's a low degree of psychological safety, they actually may not be honest in that kind of an environment. And it's the project manager who looks at that and says, there's not enough space, or there's not the right kind of space for that person, right? And that is an essential part of their communication. And so if they notice that, they might say, this development methodology doesn't work for this team. We're overlaying it as a template for who they should be, not who they are, or how they can be most effective. The last thing they'll look at is organizational and team culture. And a lot of this, you might notice, seems to stem from sort of legacy issues. So people who inherit teams, they walk into an environment and they're like, oh, this is the team that you'll be working with. And so, learning about the team culture, learning about where they came from, will help you be a better communicator with them. So if I had to break this down into sort of like one place and one idea, let me check the time, is that the big takeaway from this case study for me is that a project manager's agency, or their ability to act, their ability to lead, is awarded and constrained by members of their team and their network all the time. It's an interesting sort of communication structure. They're communicating to make space for people. If they're not making the right space, their ability to lead is diminished, right? And so the interesting thing about space is it's never the same. Because it's networked and people are coming in and out of these teams all the time, what ends up happening then as a result is they have to kind of continually learn about the people that they're working with as they kind of come and go across the team. So I've been talking a lot, so I'm gonna ask you another sort of interactive question. Without knowing how I'm defining gardening, how many of you might identify your leadership approach as gardening? I'm going to move on to the second case now. Show of hands. All right, how many people might say, more of like I'm cooking. My leadership approach is more cooking, right? And maybe some of you might believe you're a little bit of both. I think I might be a little bit of both. So the second case, I told you I did a diary study, basically, called experience sampling with 2 people. So the first case taught me about agency and taught me that project managers communicate by inviting people to participate in project work, by making the right kind of space for people to participate in project work, to pay attention to if that space is constrained and to adjust their communication to fit those people. Then the second one taught me about leadership at the project level a little bit more, right? So I took a deeper dive into agency. So let me tell you a little bit about who the gardener and the chef are. And since Bill just walked in the room, I'll tell you that these metaphors came out of a great conversation that we had about some of the work in this book. So communicating as a gardener. This book by DeMarco and Lister is called Peopleware. It's a classic project management book and a team building book. If you're interested in such things, I highly recommend you take a look at it. The version I was looking at was a newer version. I think it originally came out in the 70s. What DeMarco and Lister at this moment in the book were thinking about is that they'd spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to build teams. And they recognized you can't really build teams, right? You can grow them. And so they changed their metaphor. They'd spent for years saying you can build interdisciplinary teams, not really, but you can grow them, right? And so the interesting thing about this, though, is that you plant the seeds, you water according to the latest theory, and you hold your breath. You might get a crop, you might not. You don't really know what's going to happen, right? When you're focusing on growing as your approach. But that doesn't mean that it's any less useful, right? Communicating and working as a gardener. And so after spending some time with the gardener, I was able to distill some of her values and to talk to her a little bit about the ways in which she communicated. And so I'm skipping over some of the details from the case just to get to some of the takeaways for you. One of the things was the gardener spent a lot of time thinking about modeling methods of effective communication. And I should say as I'm explaining this that what the gardener was doing was making space in this way, right? This was the leadership philosophy, and this is how she thought about making space. And so modeling was one way of doing that. She would get an email, for instance, from somebody that was poorly worded, or maybe more urgent than it needed to be. The gardener would respond in a way that would model the types of effective communication that she would hope to see, right? She'd spend a lot of times learning about the team and the organization, and so that was one of her ways of thinking about leading. It's like, okay, I need to learn a little bit more about these people. I need to learn more about the organization. And so sometimes there were organizational norms that she wanted to learn more about. So for instance, if they didn't use a calendar to run their projects, why not? Why was there no calendar, right? And one of the other reasons for doing this is because it showed her like, oh, this is one way that I can participate. I can introduce a calendar function. And that's a way that I can help this team grow, right? She spent a lot of time thinking about communicating to include, right, and rather than exclude. And so in a way, she was saying, okay, one of the ways that I can plant the seed and help this team grow is by just saying, okay, here's an inclusive approach to communication. And then an interesting part of what her work was being accountable to her team, to the people on the team, being accountable to each other, right? And so if somebody said they were going to do something, it meant that they were actually going to do it, right? And that accountability was a part of the growth process. And then lastly, empathy, which she said was a cornerstone of her work, was very important to her to understand that things happened in people's lives and to understand how that impacts their performance at work. But you can see that these things kind of melt into each other, right? Empathy is important to modeling important effective methods of communication, right? The chef, we're going to come back to the gardener in just a second, but the chef was a little bit different. And I want to be careful here not to place these two at two ends of a continuum, because they're not. In the book, they're just two models. But they're interesting to compare, because they were different in their approaches. So if the gardener is making space by planting seeds and helping people grow, The chef is making space by giving people recipes for success, right? And so you can see from Lammers and Svetkoff's article in 2008, it's about the 80-20 rule to project management, which really has a lot to do with return on investment for your time. The chef used what you might think of as industry standard processes as a cookbook to help reproduce effectively consistent or consistently effective project management results. And so what that meant is the chef would say something to the effect of, okay, I see what the problem is here. We need to create a workflow. And so here's your recipe for a workflow. Go. Right? And so rather than saying, I'm learning from the team, that one of the ways that they could grow is we could start thinking together about how we could schedule and create a calendar. The chef was like, no, here's how you do that and go for it, right? Like there's your recipe for success. And so the communication values of the chef were a little bit different because the philosophy was different. Both of them, again, are interested in making space for people, but both of them are going about it in different ways. So the chef would often think about keeping people on task. For example, in a meeting, if two people started to dominate that meeting and talk about something that wasn't a part of the agenda, the chef would make space for everybody else in the meeting by going, hey, it sounds like you have something really important to talk about. Maybe we should schedule a follow-up meeting so you can talk about that, but right now we have to finish these things on the agenda, right? So that was sort of a value, and that was something that appeared in the sampling. Assigning roles to individuals on team, again, sort of recipe for success. Your role here is to do this. You don't need to worry about these other things. This is what your role is, right? In the system, this is what I want you to be thinking about. Communicating to clarify a team's goal or purpose. Now this came out of, the chef had this really interesting book that he told me I should read, and I did. It was called The Goal by Eli Goldratt. It's a really interesting book. It's like a business fiction novel. So it's about the business world, but it's fiction, but it's also theory. Anyway, it's very interesting. And basically the premise of the book is this. Every organization and institution has a goal, and everything must be aligned to that goal, right? You eliminate things that aren't aligned to the goal, you cut waste, then you help the institution or the organization meet its goal. In a business, in the book, the business's goal was to make money. And so you practiced and you did things to help the organization or the business make money. It's different at other institutions, right? And so when the chef would communicate with people, it was to remind them, hey, here's why we're here. Here's what we do, to bring them back into alignment, because sometimes teams would get out of alignment, particularly when they're trying to solve these sort of wicked problems that are interdisciplinary in nature. Be accountable to the project, not to the team. So if you remember the gardener, be accountable to the team, almost to like the community. Whereas the chef, because he was more systems oriented, because he was saying, here's a recipe for success, the team mattered secondary to the project. Be accountable to the project. If you're not going to do it for your teammates, do it because we have a deadline, right? There's a famous quote in out of this interview, or famous to me anyway, where he said, people have to remember that a deadline, or on my teams, people have to remember a deadline literally means you're dead if you cross that line. And that was his view of how that worked, right? That was an important element to him. So you have to be accountable to the project. And finally, we had a really interesting discussion about empathy, where the gardener talked a lot about empathy and even at times said she felt as if empathy was a weakness, that she was too empathetic at times of hers. The chef said, I don't think that I'm empathetic. And I said, well, why? And he goes, because I will listen to people talk about their feelings, but only if that means they're going to get back to work afterwards. And I said, but that's empathy. It's just a different kind of empathy. It's not the kind of empathy that we often think about, but it's empathy to motivate action, right? And so he would listen. He knew people had tough stuff happening in their lives, and so he would sit and he would listen to that, or be frustrated about work, so he would sit and he'd listen to that if it meant that productivity would occur as a result, right? So if the first case taught me that a project manager's agency is awarded and constrained by the members of their team and their network, then the second case really taught me that leadership is a communicative performance, right, of values that meet the needs of an audience, context, and situation. So the gardener was a gardener because she was hired to be a gardener. She was brought in to help that team grow. So that's the role she played. The chef was a consultant brought in to help a dysfunctional team become functional again, right? And that was his role, so that's the role he played. Both of them at times during the sampling period showed that they could be one or the other, depending on what it was that they needed to be. And I'm not trying to suggest that leadership is chameleon-oriented, like where you're constantly changing. What I'm trying to say, please don't confuse this, is that the needs of an audience, context, and situation would really bring out what it was that those project managers were doing to help lead. The ways in which they would choose to make space. Like, oh, this team is struggling. What they need me to do is give them a recipe. Whereas in other instances, it's, oh, this team at this moment, this audience with this situation and context, what they need is they need me to help them grow, right? Suffice it to say, I recognize you can give people recipes to grow, but the metaphors in and of themselves are useful for thinking about what is this situation calling on me to be, more of a gardener or more of a chef, right? And knowing that the decisions that I make are going to impact the way space is being made for people to participate and whether or not they'll exercise their agency to participate in this project work. And that's going to influence, again, my ability to lead. So, I broke these down to elements of a participatory communication. If we had to say, what is it that project managers are doing, right? What are the three elements? If at root, what are they doing? Is that their communication tends to be reactive, but it's intentional, meaning that they react to the things that they see in front of them, communication problems that surface, but they do so in intentional ways. Meaning that they never just go, oh, hold on, wait a minute, and then just think without speaking. You can see from the strategies that a lot of the times what they're doing is carefully thinking about a lot of the social factors that are part of project work, right? They're also thinking a lot about a lot about space. They're thinking a lot about what's going to happen as a result of this, which gets me to the second one, which is future action. This is a term I borrow from a graduate of our rhetoric and writing program, Stacy Pigg, who's a colleague of mine that I work with from time to time. And she talks about future action as kind of thinking about what's going to happen down the line as a result of this, right? Project managers are concerned with how a given communication is going to affect a relationship down the road. And so they're not just thinking, part of their intention is thinking, how is this going to impact space, but then how is this going to impact our relationship down the road, this person's ability to participate in other ways. And then finally that it's systems-based. And by being systems-based, that they're aware that they're communicating across this network, right? And not only that, but that there are other sort of systems in place, like we saw with gender, right? And that these systems are influencing the ways in which people are participating in very real and important ways that they need to take action on and that they need to respond to. So, my timing is better now. I was really worried I wasn't going to get through all that in time. So I come back to the case study that I started with. Same case study, but my question at the bottom has changed. If your goal is to communicate to make space for participation, if that is your heuristic, to invite someone to exercise their agency, how might you proceed based on the framework of focusing on being intentional and reactive, considering future action and understanding the systems contributing to how communication is received? Did your decision change from before we started about how you might proceed or the questions you might ask? I'm asking, I want you to answer that question. Any brave souls? Thank you, Kristen. No? It did not change. Okay. Why not?
I'm not sure if I know, I can articulate why, but what I would have done is then to invite a person to a coffee or something to talk about what's going on and see if there's something about the way that the team is working, or if it's just some external factor that's temporary that's causing them to not participate, to kind of help bring them back into the team and see if anything arises. And so that strategy is still one within these frameworks that I think makes sense to me in terms of it being an opportunity to diagnose a thing and give the person a chance to be involved.
Right.
Oh, it's too late.
Good. So you were intuitively there. Yes?
Yeah, I'll say that mine changed. I had a similar reaction to the person who just spoke, but I don't know. Listening to your talk made me think that as project manager, it'd be more my responsibility to create space, to intentionally think about, regardless of whether it's that person's, it's an issue particular to that one person, who that person is, and why that person might not have a particular amount of space in the conversation, and to create that anyway.
Yeah.
I might still have this talk with them, but it gives me the opportunity to reflect on who my team is, that they're not talking.
Right.
And then create that space in case that person needed it, and follow up on if it's a individual issue. Because if that space wasn't there to begin with anyway, then that's a problem.
So you'd be looking at the broader system a little bit more.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Anybody else want to share? There's not a high degree of psychological safety in sharing right now, is what you're telling me. So I'm going to extend real quickly to a final thing, and then there will be time for questions. And I'm going to run through this relatively quickly. So my interest in writing this book started off sort of thinking about project management and leadership. And then I realized at some point when I was writing it, and then when I finished, like, oh, I'm studying these huge sort of distributed, decentralized environments, and universities are a lot like that, right? And so I started thinking, like, I wonder what I can take from my book and some of the things that I learned from my book and how it might influence work that I wanted to do around the university, that I saw I wanted to do. So what I started to do is I started to ask questions about housing insecurity on MSU's campus among our student population. And this just sort of happened because I had been working with the Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness on some things, and we tried to get some numbers, and we learned that we could get some numbers, but we wanted to get more. We wanted to get a better sense of it. And a series of reports had come out from the Wisconsin Hope Lab, which is now at Temple. They released a report called Still Hungry and Homeless in College. You can Google that, and you can download a report. I can also add you to my slides on Google Drive, and I've linked all of them, so that will be easier for you to read. But 9% of university students in their report had been homeless in the last 12 months. 36% had been housing insecure, which is a significant number. The University of Michigan Poverty Center released a report talking about K through 12 populations. 6% of Lansing K through 12 students were homeless during the school year. This was 2015, 2016. Michigan ranked sixth nationwide among states for homeless students, assuming that some of those students might be coming here. And that NC State University, which is the closest comparable I could grab so far, of students surveyed, 9.6% experienced homelessness in the previous 12 months, and 3.5% in the last 30 days of that report, which just came out in 2018. Those numbers were startling to me. And so if say that number holds here at MSU, assuming we have approximately 50,000 students, that means close to 4,500 have been homeless in the last 12 months, and 1,700 would have experienced homelessness in the last 30 days. That's a lot. I don't know that those numbers hold at MSU yet, so I can't make that claim. But that's the exigence for the work. The questions I frequently get is, how do you define homelessness in that context then? And so the HUD definition is the very popular definition where you'll see 4 categories: literally homeless, meaning you have nowhere to go. The second would be category 2, imminent risk of homelessness. And that would mean that within about 14 days, you'll have nowhere to go. Category 3 is homeless under other federal statutes. So for instance, say you are aging out of foster care, right? That's an example. And then category 4 is attempting to flee domestic violence, and you have nowhere to go. Now, they don't consider you homeless under the HUD definition, though, if you have friends to stay with. And so some people have criticized that and said that that's problematic, because many folks live in motels, vehicles, and other hidden locations, and that a lot of the homeless population actually tries to avoid being identified as homeless. They don't want to be a part of the system. And that's also true for students, from what we've read, to a degree. The Department of Education, on the other hand, includes those students who might be staying in temporary living situations with family or friends, allowing for a broader count. So that's some of the exigence for the work, right? And so how do I extend some of what I'd learned? Well, instead of thinking of it as a team, I put together a small working group. And at first I thought of us as a team, and then one day I kind of add this, well, we're not a team. We're a group of networked actors from across campus. And it's like, of course, I've learned this already, but sometimes you have to learn things a few times. This was me learning it for the few times. So housing insecurity and homelessness it's a systemic issue. It's a wicked problem. It requires interdisciplinary teams, meaning it requires stakeholders from all over a campus to participate in making that kind of change. And MSU is a decentralized institution. And so our goal became very simply early on to invite more people to participate in the network. And the more people who are participating in the network, the more change that we could see that would be sustainable and provide long-term solutions, right? And so rather than one person saying, we're going to make all this change and centralize it, I decentralized it and just said, basically what I've told you, and, you know, how do you feel compelled to act and participate? And so inviting particular stakeholders to participate has been really interesting. We're probably somewhere around 15 to 20 people who are interested in participating, and that's just because there's only a few people who are doing the invitations, right? I imagine if there were more invitations going out, there'd be more people. So our invitations are simply about asking people to exercise their agency, right? Which is what I distilled from the book. And so I give you an example here from our new director of CAPS, who gave me permission to share this with you after our conversation. And you can see that what I did is I went and I talked to him in the same way I've talked to you about it. It was a great conversation. And he made some small changes. And I actually think that what you see here about food insecurity is really important. And so he immediately adjusted their intake forms to include 2 additional options. I'm currently homeless, and I do not consistently have a secure place to live, because they didn't have those questions before. So if you went to CAPS and you were filling out that intake form, there were no questions about housing insecurity. So after talking with me, he's like, we made a change. And this was within 24 to maybe 48 hours I received this email after our meeting. It was quick. We do have another question that asks, within the past 6 months, I've worried about having enough food. And if you look at that statistic, like 531 students, and this is just from August 20th to the day that we met, which was, 2 weeks ago. 6.9%, 7% of students reporting yes, right? So I'm really interested to see what we learned from the first 2 questions. And that you can see that the future collaboration will continue. And I share this with you because I think it's important to say that the way, not every thing that we take on, not every interdisciplinary wicked problem that we take on and try to solve works from a decentralized standpoint like I'm advocating here, but some do. And I think when we're doing that kind of work, the leaders who are spending time making space for people to participate and exercise their agency to participate are the ones that are going to find that these decentralized networks are more healthy and more responsive to individual needs. And that, for me, it's been a productive sort of way forward working on a project that is near and dear to my heart in terms of housing and security on campus. And so I'll show you this slide that tells you that these are some of the things we're thinking of doing as we move forward, and that's in flux, and I'm happy to answer questions about that. But with 10 minutes left, I would like to open up the floor to any questions you might have for me. Thank you.
So, if there are any questions, use this microphone to make sure that the question shows up on the recording. It isn't going to amplify your voice.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. So thinking back about the scenario that you introduced, a lot of the techniques that the managers were talking about that they were using are very like forward thinking.
Yeah.
So like future action.
Just gonna sorry, I'm going to grab some water. I'm going to keep listening to you.
And I was just curious if they were inclined at all to think about like things that they might have missed looking back at their team, and any details like that their team members might have shared to them that maybe holds new resonance or something like that. So
Yes, I think, actually, I'm just going to, sorry. Let me grab some water really quickly. I do think that project managers did think a lot about that for their team. Like I did see that kind of evidence. I'm trying to remember what the first half of your question was, though. Could you repeat that for me?
really just thinking about sort of the strategies that you are pretty common on the managers that you talked about.
Yeah.
How they seem very forward thinking to me.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there's any space where they can look back at themselves and how they contributed.
Sometimes, but not always. You know, I'd like to tell you that that's true, but sometimes that was true, but not always. I think in some of the more reflective people, for sure. But I think for some of them, I mean, there were moments where stereotypes were very much the ways in which they thought about people, and that's because that's how they'd been trained to categorize people, and then that's how you deal with that personality. And they'd even use that word "deal," which is a word that I've never liked. You know, rather than working with somebody, it's like, oh, I've got to deal with this personality. So I would like to say in some of them, yes, they had made space for themselves to reflect. But in some cases, I think it was just a matter of trying to be intentional about the ways that they would communicate. So yes and no. Thank you for that question.
Hey Ben, I'm curious for the two major cases, were those the primary two project managers so how many project managers did you talk to for this work in coming up with and thinking around the two metaphors you used, the two models?
How many?
Yeah, was it just the two?
For the gardener and the chef one?
Yeah.
Yeah, just those two.
Okay, so knowing that, I'm curious what you think the potential interactions between the genders of those two project managers and the subsequent interpretations of the work as either gardener or chef, and whether or not you see potential intersections in that with how those particular roles were interpreted. So I asked that because when I think of a gardener, like I was talking to Kristen about, and I know that I've briefly talked to you about these months ago,
Yeah.
but I could look at the role of the gardener as being different, or the role of a chef as being different than what you outlined.
Yeah.
So whether or not you talked about that with the project managers and kind of teased apart their interpretations of this type of work, and whether or not you think the fact that you had one that at least you identified publicly as he and one you identified publicly as she, and whether or not there's potential intersections there. Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, just related to that, I think that there is something about the metaphors of gardener and chef that reflect societal gender stereotypes as well. Simply in that most gardeners, at least in American culture, are associated with women.
I could be wrong, I am not, I'm a researcher in this area, and that we have lots of examples of how chefs the world of chefs are male-dominated fields, and the way that those things are characterized. I'm not saying that you don't have some truth in there or anything like that.
Yeah.
It still resonated with me, but I wonder what that means.
That's actually, too, at the heart of, thanks, Kristen, because of the ways it's less about whether or not we look at statistically who are fulfilling these roles, but the stereotypes around the ways in which particularly they're characterized in this particular model.
Yeah.
So gardeners as being caring about growth versus gardeners as working to sustain or thinking about the recipes for how you actually outline a garden, what goes into the work of building a garden. So there's a whole lot of else that we could have teased apart from that, and I'm really curious about what came out of your interviews with them.
Yeah. There's a lot there to respond to. So let me try to go little by little. The first is the two metaphors come out of project management literature. So I didn't make them up. I found them as the two ways that people predominantly talk about project management and leadership, which is not something that's talked about a lot. The second thing is that in the book, I actually talk a lot more about the metaphors than I did to you because of time. So the gardener, most definitely, one of the arguments that I had with myself is that gardening is also super systematic, right? And so how do we do that? The third is I actually talked to both participants about the metaphors, and they both agreed with me. And then I sent them the chapter when I was done and said, what do you think? And they said, I wouldn't change anything. Or they didn't say they had anything to change. Let me put it that way. In fact, when I talked to the gardener about the metaphor, the gardener laughed and said, I'm a gardener. They self-identified in that way. And so I was worried about those metaphors for that particular reason. In the interviews, when we talked about it, the chef was very much systems-oriented and spent a lot of time thinking and talking about systems. And so while I tried to figure out ways to describe what that system was, because the chef was also something that's in the book that I didn't talk about here. The chef was also trained in Black Belt Six Sigma, you know, and so everything was process improvement. It was all recipes. It was like, this is how we assess and evaluate what we do. And so while I recognize that those metaphors aren't perfect representations, I thought of them as, well, they have a tradition and a history inside of project management literature. And because they have that history and tradition inside of it, it will speak to who my audience is in a particular way, right? Because the series that I published in it's supposed to be path theoretical, but it's also supposed to be something that people can use. And so I thought, well, these metaphors are useful in that way. Did I worry about the fact that they kind of reinforce stereotypes in certain ways? Yes. The way that I spent time thinking about that was largely checking in with the participants and asking them, do you feel like this represents you? And because they felt like, at least I for certain feel comfortable knowing that the gardener feels that way. I won't get into the details of all of that because that's kind of behind the scenes research stuff, and I don't think that they would feel comfortable with me talking about that. I had lots of conversations with them. In fact, the way that that method went for me is you would sample their experience for a week, and then I'd have about an hour to 90-minute conversation with them about what I'd seen, saying, am I seeing this right? And I would do that every week with them. And then at the end, in the book, one of the things I didn't show you is I actually have them mind map their communication strategies at work. And you'll notice in the mind maps themselves that the gardener privileges people over the project and the chef privileges the project over the people. Like, there was so much evidence, there was no other way for me, after I got these metaphors in my head, to think about them. Other than inventing new metaphors, but I was worried that that would then turn away project managers who were aware of these metaphors already. My goal for it was to instead say, look, I want you to realize that the reason the gardener is a gardener is because she's hired to be one, and the chef was a chef because he was hired to be one. And I felt like that talked back to those metaphors a little bit. that the gardener had tendencies to be a chef at times, and the chef had a tendency to be a gardener at times, and that it's important that we recognize that what they were doing was reading a context, situation, and audience and responding to it from a leadership perspective, because that's what they knew was best for the group, and that's what they were being asked to do. So yeah, I did worry about that, but that's how I thought about it, for better or for worse. Thank you, everyone.